Welcome. It's Jeff Mayhew. It's John Beatty. It's Politics and Parenting, where we talk about politics, but we talk about it differently. John, how are you doing today?
I think I'm in the midst of a stomach bug. I'm like the last domino to fall in our family. So bear
Oh,
with me if I have to make any quick exits from this recording.
oh
But
my goodness. The stomach bug in that big family just seems to never go away, does it?
no, it doesn't. And then we had it's been making the rounds. We thought we were clear on Friday, so we had a little celebration for little Clementine who turned 1. And
Oh,
now my mom is texting me that my sisters are starting to go down along with it. So it
oh man.
spreads. What is it? Public transmission is real.
That's right. Um,
How are you
yeah,
guys?
we had a week off, John. How did we had our Madisonian meeting on the 21st last week. After that, I was a little drained. I think we all were. And we couldn't get around the recording, but it was nice to have a week off, to be honest with you. And it was a good meeting. What did you think about it?
I thought it went really, really well. I mean, there's one thing to see their RSVPs, and it's another thing to see butts in the seats, as they say, or they like to say on the school board, boots on the ground. So it was amazing to just have a lot of people in the room. It's been much more successful than the ones we had last summer, and I think that's because we last summer was a period of refinement, and we got the story down. But I think people are really interested in the comments I heard afterwards. People learned a lot, or they thought it was like spot on. So it was good.
Yeah, it was really exciting. Those RSVPs are hard to judge, because they come in super late. I love you people, but the RSVPing is late, and that's okay. It just gets me all nervous the week before, thinking I'm gonna have an empty room. But yeah, I think we had almost 30 people in the room, which was fantastic. Last year we typically had between 10 to maybe 20 people at the most. At our last year's meetings, and like I tell people, those were beta tests, right? You and I, we were just kind of like feeling out the realm, trying to figure out what we were doing, craft our story, right? Because that's what history is. It's a
That's right.
story. And yeah, I was really excited about it. We had a history teacher in the room. We had, small business owners. Like we had a whole variety of people, and it was really exciting. Great conversation. Really nice.
Authors, we had authors too.
Yeah, we had we had professional authors in the room. That's right. And yeah, it was great conversation. Let's for our listeners out there that weren't able to make the meeting, let's just do a little recap of what the meeting structure was.
So you had really nice pamphlets picked up. I'm just going to look what the next meeting is. People can put on their calendars right now. It's February 18th, if I recall. So
Yes.
at your steppies, be there. So if this what's your whistle at all, you can go to MadisonianRepublicans.com and RSVP. We got that page set up, and that link will be in the show notes for that. But it was I think the idea was to kind of tell our founding story and sort of who we are. And there's so much of an attempt in sort of modern day to kind of denigrate who we were, where we come from, in an
Mhm.
effort to sort of like, well, look at all these problems. They're unfixable and unresolvable, and there's nothing we can do about it. When in reality, we're people. People make mistakes. People are imperfect, but people can also come together to make truly resilient and incredible inventions, if you will. Uh, Recapitulations, retellings of how to govern ourselves, and I think that's what our Constitution is. So you try to tell it from the idea of the executive, and that was your major theme. So I think
Right.
the first time frame was when we had no executive, right? It was just
Right.
well, I guess it was an English monarch was the executive.
So yeah, I mean, technically we didn't have an executive. That was this like limbo period. And so for our listeners out there, let me start with one thing. I went to church today and I heard this great sermon by Pastor Barry. And at the very end, he said this, and I think it goes into exactly what the first meeting was. And he said, sometimes we need to go back to the beginning to understand who we are supposed to be. Why? Because we drift. And that was the idea of this first meeting. I wanted to tell our founding story from where I perceive the idea of freedom and independence coming from, to the point where the powers that brought that the United States into power had faded and kind of gone away. And
Mhm.
and I the timeline that I have decided to carve out is 1754 to 1829, and that's the beginning of the French and Indian War, and then the end of the Adams administration and the beginning of the Jackson administration. I wrote a pretty concise article about this, basically tracking the powers. I put it out this week after our meeting. It's called The History of the United States, Tracking Power 1754 to 1829. Check it out. And yeah, so and I wanted to, like you said, tell the story for, it's not necessarily the executive, but it is because those are the people that had the most sway at that time. That's kind of how our country has worked. The executive is that guiding force. They're supposed to listen and guide the people. But back then, they had everything was new, and people were used to being guided by a central point of authority because they were used to a king or monarch. And so, yeah, I start with that no executive period of time where Ben Franklin's going across the ocean trying to get us some representation. And then we carve into Washington and Adams and Jefferson. We watch all these different things start to happen, and we start to drift. We start to drift, but yeah.
No, I think what you said, like I wouldn't say it's like where our freedoms come from. It's where our freedoms like crystallize, because a lot of these ideas are ancient, or they're sort of Enlightenment era sort of discovering through after the Middle Ages. And I think it's that crystallization where we sort of we realize that we are a self-governing people. There's people across the Atlantic Ocean that don't want us to be self-governing, and we break free. And that have you seen that Glass show on Netflix? It's kind of a niche thing, but like there's a point where you're blowing glass and stuff, and then in order to, you've got a little ball that you hold on your blowpipe, and you're working through the glass, but at some point you have to make it cool, and then you can do a clean cut with a little piece of metal. And I think that's where we were, where we had built this edifice and these sort of the roots of our freedom from England, from the Romans, from the Greeks. And then at some point we realized, hey, this is a finished piece that we can sort of take off and then add and make our own. We don't need England's help to kind of blow it. And that's like that breaking point.
Yeah.
But like all glass, it gets dusty and dirty. And I think that's what you're trying to point out, is like, we've got this shining edifice of Washington, an amazing first president. But then we get kind of Adams, who maybe wasn't so suited for the job. And, he did an admirable job through there, but he had an adversarial relationship with his vice president that was pretty toxic. I mean, you can tell that story about how they literally started a newspaper to go against him.
Well, I mean, and there's a lot of things that go into that. And first, I push back on the idea that John Adams wasn't suited for the job. He may have been a petty man, and he may have been tempestuous and kind of difficult to be around, but he was absolutely suited for the job because he handled a very difficult situation very well. Because the rules were still being created, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, so we had the Philadelphia Convention, but then like we realized immediately, like, hey, we really don't have a great process for this vice president job. Well, just whoever finishes second. And then, as the parties start to form, and then it's like, wait, you have a vice president who's an adversary. And that's what happened in the administration. Thomas Jefferson and him were really good friends. They start to kind of drift apart as the country comes together. When Jefferson is the Secretary of State and the French Revolution happens, they find themselves on opposite sides of this issue. And during the administration, Jefferson and Madison, but as vice president, Jefferson was openly hostile to Adams. He made it really difficult, and Adams had a very difficult situation to navigate because they were on the brink of war with France. Like it was not a great time. You would hope that your countrymen, your president and vice president, would be on the same team, working in the same direction. And when they're working opposed to each other, it's not really great for the country. Luckily, Adams was able to pull that off. Jefferson goes on to win the presidency and kind of start that new era of good feelings with that one party rule where it was like Republican, 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 Republican. And you kind of lost the Federalist, which in some ways is really good. In other ways, it's not so good. But yeah, I mean, I think if you're Adams, if you have a little bit more personality, a little bit more gravitas, maybe you're able to like sway somebody like James Madison, for example, onto your side and cool the tempers of Jefferson, because Jefferson was just this very idealistic person who really didn't want to be told he was wrong in any circumstance.
No, never.
And we talk about this a lot in modern day, is fake news, right? Well, where did fake news come from? Well, a lot of it could be traced back to Thomas Jefferson and this idea, like he literally helped start papers to trash Adams and support the French, who were against us at the time. So, the whole Congress passed the Aliens and Sedition Act. John Adams signs it in the law, even though he's kind of iffy on the constitutionality of it. But it was necessary in one aspect, because you can't have your vice president and papers going around basically writing seditious libel. But at the same time, you don't want to silence free speech, because that's the one of the most important things that our Constitution and Bill of Rights granted us. So it was this really difficult time. But yeah, it's funny how that kind of works out. And Adams gets labeled this guy who was somewhat inept because of it, but his challenges were different than Washington's,
Yeah, right.
And he made some managerial mistakes as well. He kind of went in a little naive to the job, because he's literally only the second person to do it. So you're literally learning on it. And he kept a lot of Washington's cabinet. And I think that was a big mistake from the beginning. He didn't bring in his own people. That idea of patronage, and bringing in your own team to work with and check and balance you, I think proved helpful for Washington, did not work so well for Adams.
Yeah, and it's not just the money flows one way, but it's sort of loyalty falls another way, where if you ask someone to do something, they'll actually do it for you. And I think that's a key thing in terms of getting something done when you're just a single executive. Like, by nature, you have to delegate a whole lot. So if you have a cabinet that's going to fight you on everything, it just makes it harder to actually do your job and to be the executor of the laws that come across.
Right. And then we go into the Jefferson administration. We get the Louisiana Purchase. We expand our country. Things are kind of going really well. During that period of time, we start to fight against the British again. Jefferson was always very hostile towards the British. I mean, they were our oppressors to some degree. And Madison and him, Madison is Secretary of State at this time, they do the embargo on British. And ultimately, this leads to war during the Madison administration in 1812. The country is literally like falling apart at the seams. Andrew Jackson comes out of nowhere. The Battle of New Orleans breathes hope back into the nation. This happened after the Treaty of Ghent was signed, but before anyone knew about it, right? So the war was actually over, but the Americans really felt like they were losing, and losing the Battle of New Orleans would have meant like devastation. The country would have been split in half. There was a section of the Federalists that were like ready to leave and secede from the nation. Andrew Jackson, pulls it back together. And then you get that continuation of the Republican rule with James Monroe is the next president, and then ultimately John Quincy Adams. And again, what you see is you start to see that one side drift further and further away from the country. They're focusing on their perspective and not seeing the whole perspective, or at the very least, they're not doing a good enough job communicating it to the American people so they understand what's going on. You get the Tariff of Abominations, which really starts to, spread things, divide people, because it overwhelmingly hurts one part of the nation as opposed to another. You get the invention of the cotton gin, which makes cotton a cash crop, and which unfortunately intertwines the economic interests of the South with slavery for a long period of time. So one of the things we talked about in the meeting is, were our founders intending on keeping slavery, or was their goal to ease it out? And I maintain that their goal was to push it out. And it's with, that happening, the Eli Whitney and the cotton gin, where it starts to change during the Monroe and Adams administration. And by the time you get to the next era, you really see that take hold. It's the next generation of American leaders, not the founding generation, that really wanted to preserve slavery. The founding generation wanted to get rid of slavery. It was the John C. Calhoun's, the Southern blockade that was trying to push slavery out into the new territories. That was that aspect. And I think it's really important that people know that, because our founders, I think, yes, they were slaveholders. Yes, they, could have done better, but at the
Yeah.
same time, they were literally born into it. It's, you have very little control sometimes when you're born.
I'd say
Thomas
you have zero control when you're born.
well, I'm like in your family,
Yeah.
to change things immediately. If you have a family that has a lot of slaves and your economic interests reside on it, as far as like your survival, it's hard to just say, okay, let's start from scratch and get rid of everything. It is something that does need to be eased out over time. Slavery was a much more humane thing during that founding period. It got really bad after that, in the second part, when where they capped the slave trade, the amount of slaves in the country, like the cost of them went up, which made the slaveholders even more wealthy, and they
Mhm.
were just cruel, and they denigrated these people, just awful. Where you see a lot of our founders, they freed their slaves, or they attempted to free their slaves in different circumstances. So I think that's just it's something that people should know, at the very least. If you're going to be mad at somebody, be mad at the right people.
Right. John C. Calhoun.
I he's not the I use his name, but I'm not trying to throw just him under the bus. There was a lot
No,
of
there's,
people.
no, there's a lot of people because there's a lot of money behind it. I mean, like that
Right.
was I think that's one of the reasons probably people went along with getting rid of the African slave trade, was they realized this could be actually economically beneficial, which again is awful when you're dealing with humans.
Right.
But that when you start making decisions where you're going to denigrate someone, you kind of have to keep going down that path, because otherwise your conscience kicks in and says, whoa, that's not a good idea. And
Right.
then you do have to kind of throw everything and start from over. So it's just human nature. It's much easier to slide into a sin like that, almost, where the ability to break free from that is incredibly difficult and requires a lot of virtue. Unfortunately, like a war, if it's a war inside yourself or a war externally.
Right. So we got to the tariffs of abomination. That's during the John Quincy Adams administration, right? And then we had, before that, we had the Crook Bargain of 1824. And this is where what was going on was the Republican power, that Virginia alliance that had elected a whole bunch of people, right? They nominated Jefferson, they nominated Madison, they nominated Monroe. They did not nominate Adams. Now, James Monroe, when he came in, the country was pulling apart a little bit. Right after the War of 1812, things were difficult, and he came in with this Union effect, where he was looking back to Washington's cabinet, and he was like, "I'm going to pick people out of different places of the country to unite us together," and he did a really good job of this. He doesn't get enough credit in history, I think. He brought in the Federalist, who are the old Federalist, John Quincy Adams. He was from Massachusetts, and into that Secretary of State spot. That was really James Monroe's like handpicked successor, right? Like this really was kind of a little bit of an aristocracy to a degree,
Mhm.
but aristocracy of people who really meant well and were trying to maintain the founders' intent. And the Virginia delegation nominated William Crawford instead. And what this did is it divided power within the Republican Party. Now, a lot of people in the southern states in the West, they were afraid of William Crawford, because William Crawford had this very mischievous past, where he was aligned with Aaron Burr when Aaron Burr was trying to, carve out a little piece of the West for
Yep.
Mexico and become emperor or whatever. He ratted on Burr to save his own hide, realistically. And then, he did some sketchy things. Andrew Jackson was not a fan of this man. And this Southern delegation went to Andrew Jackson. They were like, "Look, we're afraid Crawford's going to win the presidency. We don't think Adams can beat him. We want to nominate you." So, and you've already got Clay running as well from the West. So now you've divided all that power out, and Jackson ends up winning, I believe, the popular vote. He ends up winning a majority of the electoral college. But nobody reaches the threshold for presidency. So what happens? It goes to the top three, and it goes to the House. William Clay realizes that, he doesn't really like Andrew Jackson. He doesn't really like Adams either. He's kind of up in there. He's really about himself, but he ends up throwing his support behind Adams, gets the Secretary of State job, which again, that's the launching pad to the United States. And Andrew Jackson is just livid over this because he feels like he was cut out of the process. He feels like he should have been the president. And in a lot of ways, you can make the argument that he should have been, that the American people wanted him. And that's where that power broke, right? That's where the Republican Party lost the people, because he was able to take that argument along with the bad things that happened during the Tariff of Abomination, which, by the way, Jackson voted for as a senator, FYI. He was able to use that and launch himself into the presidency in 1828. He became the first populist president. It was about aligning the people with the executive to get things done. And it really propelled our country into that next phase. And that's where that breaking point is. And so we had a few questions at the end of our packet, didn't we? And one of the first ones was, what was the main cause of the Revolutionary War?
Representation.
And how often do you hear that other word said when that question is asked?
All the time. All people talk about is taxation, because they talk about the Boston Tea Party, and they talk about the Stamp Act, and they talk about I think we had our own tariffs of abomination.
Huh?
We didn't know the tax of, what was it? Tax of abomination or something? There wasn't. Oh, the Abominable Acts. That's what it was.
Yes. Yeah. And the Townsend Act, right? And you're 100% right. And everybody associates. They go, well, the British were taxing us, right? But we just wanted a say in the taxes. Like, we understood that they were going to tax us. They were at war. This was a common practice. People knew that if Britain's going to send soldiers here to protect us against the French and the Indians, then they're going to have to be paid, and therefore taxes are going to need to be levied. But the Parliament was deciding the taxes. They weren't distributing them evenly throughout the colonies, and it was overwhelmingly hurting certain parts of the country. And we just wanted a say in what was going on. All we wanted was some representation, and they refused. And that's where, like, once your authority says, no, we're not going to listen to you, basically what they're saying is they don't want to govern you anymore. And that's where it's like, all right, well, it becomes a revolution at that point. It becomes like, hey, if they're not going to govern us, we're going to have to govern ourselves. We're going to have to take this over. So yeah, I think that's really important to understand, is our revolution, it was fought over representation, which, if you hear me talk, I talk about representation a lot.
Well, I'm like, that's a tradition. The tradition is, in the British system, if you wanted to get taxes, the king would sort of ask the people to get taxes, and the people would give the taxes to the king. Right. So, like, and in the dialogue around this, sort of before we declared independence, there was sort of this idea that maybe we don't really want to not be British subjects. We just, we want to have a seat at the table. We're okay to pay duties and imports on British goods. We're okay that you limit that we can only trade with the British. Like, they were fine with that. But it's when the Parliament sort of came into the ordinary operating day-to-day lives, the Stamp Act, where if you had to get a marriage certificate, that was a tax on that. Like, that affects your day-to-day life. And people hadn't, they could petition Parliament, but Parliament was under no obligation to listen to that. And they didn't listen to that. And they just said, oh, we got to pay for our war. We got to pay for our bureaucracy. And, we got to pay for all the civil servants over in America. So we're going to pay with those duties and those taxes.
And realistically, I mean, what Franklin saw over there was, he saw a ballooned government that wasn't paying attention to itself. They were completely corrupted by both private and corporate interests. And that's, that's terrible. Like, when you're going in, if your boss or your company or if your country is taxing you and you see them spending the money very poorly, you're like, whoa, step back here. I think you're doing this for yourself and not for us. And I think we can relate to that a little bit.
Sounds like a local school board that I know of.
So one of the other questions, we talked a little bit about the Philadelphia Convention at there. What was the major topic of discussion at the Philadelphia Convention? Representation, right? And you mentioned it before. It was like, we took all these different ideas from the Greeks and all these different governments that went through. And the main point of what Madison was really trying to, like, install into our nation was this idea of self-governance, this idea of representation. And that's why we ended up with a Republican form of government, and not just a single federal Republican form, but also the Constitution guarantees that all state governments are Republican in nature as well, which is really important because, and this was a question on our thing, why did our founders choose a Republican form of government?
Because it balances power the best. It gives, it cedes a little bit of people a power to up to the top so they can make decisions. But at the end of the day, allows people at the bottom to petition their leaders to make, to select their leaders in order to make sure that the right decisions are getting made. I think like that's one of the key parts of choosing that Republican.
Right. And I like to tell people the Republican form of government works best because it takes a big problem, big government, and it breaks it down into something small. And think about anything you've ever done in your life, right? Like you've got a big project. What's the first thing you do? You break it down into small little projects and you step by step through the process until you've completed the larger project. Same thing with our federal government. And that's why our founders really wanted a Republican form. And they did so in this representative form that guaranteed that the people would have control over it. And it's really a brilliant invention as long as people understand it and know how to use it.
Yeah, that's interesting. You describe it like that because in computer science, the recursion is an algorithm that you use, but it's basically taking a large problem and breaking it down into small parts. And then when you get to the base level, you found sort of a single unit, and then from that single unit, you come right back up and you actually solve your problem. And interestingly enough, that's the fastest kind of algorithm. So maybe that's nature mirrors itself all throughout in terms of governance and computing. And
yeah, I see that over and over again because I've talked about before, I think republicanism in a large degree is kind of like capitalism. They have the same structural form. We talked I already went over the slavery thing. What happened as soon as we became united?
we fought with each other.
We started tearing each other apart, man. It's kind of like it's kind of like a relationship, right? You meet, you fall in love, you date, you get engaged, you're all excited, you're planning for that wedding, you get married, you go on your honeymoon, you come home, and now life begins. And you're like, oh man, you clipped your toenails there? Like, do you put the dirty dishes away? Like, what's going on over here? That's what happened to our country, right?
Right.
Like we were all on the same page. We wanted this beautiful wedding and all this freedom and independence. And then all of a sudden we both went home to our houses and like, we were just slobs, like we just didn't respect each other. We didn't know how to communicate with each other. We were arguing and fighting, and, it kind of pulls you apart. Luckily, we hit some counseling after the War of 1812. We were able to mend ourselves a little bit. But yeah, I mean, it's important to know because I think sometimes like regular Americans, or at least myself, a few years ago, you watch this stuff on TV, it becomes scary. Maybe it's a little comforting to know that it's happened before, and we can overcome these difficulties.
Well, and it's not just the War of 1812, but even as soon as we win the War of Independence, we've got the Continental Congress, which is 13 equal votes. Every state gets a right, and people are bickering over taxation and sort of, and like, how do we pay for our debts? How do we govern ourselves? Death and taxes, and the deficiencies of that Continental Congress system lead to a desire for a constitutional convention, and that's what you get our Constitution, and and we've got the way to amend it.
Yeah, and one of the the main points of that Philadelphia Convention was to create a central form of authority, right? And like you talked about before, I laid my packet out in that authority. Who was in charge? Where were they leading us? And that's important to understand, because if you know what the intent of the leader is, at least you can understand why he made his decisions.
Right.
And that's intent is very important. And so yeah, we created this central point of authority. We had these two different factions, the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist. One was for it, one was against it. Eventually it gets ratified. You get full representation for the people along with the states. You get this very check and balance government that's beautifully designed, but it has flaws, but it has an amendment process so you can work on the flaws. You've got Bill of Rights that guaranteed certain rights to the American people, specifically the number 1 and number 2, the right of free speech and the right to bear arms. Back then and even now, if you want to be free, there's realistically 2 ways to be free. You can be free using your voice and convincing a whole large amount of people to go to the assembly to vote out the legislators, vote in new legislators, and create new leadership that balances your country. Or you can go to war, you can create a revolution. And we don't want number two. Like, we never want number two, because that always hurts the regular people, the people that don't have the money to pay for other soldiers to represent them, and all those different things that happen when war comes about. So it is
But it's
really
it's someone said it's the soapbox, it's the ballot box, and then it's the bullet box. Like,
yeah,
that's kind of the way it goes. And thankfully we're still at the ballot box and the soapbox. But you can imagine when you are being heard, you feel like
right.
you have no remedies.
Yeah, and it was harder to be heard back then because there was far less, forms of communication. Although I think harder and easier. If you were eloquent enough, you could just ride into the Capitol and talk to people, right? But that was also difficult because it wasn't easy to just travel as easy. And also, we didn't have the Capitol. There was no Capitol back then. But you can find your delegation. That was part of the structure. They thought about that when dividing the districts out and making sure that they were within, traveling distance for regular citizens, so they could actually have a conversation with their representative. Because, as we will learn in a future class, representation is communication.
Well, and like talking about the Constitution being imperfect and needing to be updated, like I think that was the original ratification of it. Everyone realized, well, many people realized that it was missing certain things. Like the whole Bill of Rights was sort of a backroom, not really backroom deal, but sort of a secondary thing. Like, let's get the Constitution in place, and then we'll kind of fill it in with these rights that everyone has and agrees to. But we're not gonna put them in the original document, so people don't fight about and bike shed about. Let's get the skeleton in place, and then we'll start putting the sort of the meat on the bones.
Yeah.
Because like the Bill of Rights, Congress puts that in there, but no one that wasn't guaranteed by any of the people that ratified it initially.
Right, that's true. And that's why, like, people like George Mason, Patrick Henry, that's why they didn't sign the Constitution, because they
Right.
wanted a Bill of Rights in there. They were against the central point of authority, and they were like, hey, look, if you're gonna have a central point of authority, guarantee these individual rights, because it's all about balance. And there was enough consensus where they were going to do it, but because it wasn't all done at once, they were like, look, I don't want my name on this, because who knows what happens after I sign it. Like, this may never actually happen. Luckily it did happen. The Bill of Rights are very important. So
Never been more important.
yeah. So yeah, that's a little brief overview of our class. Like I mentioned, I've got an article out, go read that. I'm working on the next article, which is going to be, it's not part two. It's actually, I call it the threads of the old republic. It's the little pieces that connect, that happened during the founding era, that created the Jacksonian era. I'm going to highlight those and talk about them a little bit. And then during the second half of our meeting schedule of the year, we will do the Jacksonian era. And that's going to go from 1829 to 1861. I know typically history classes, they break these things up. It's the Jacksonia and then the antebellum period, but I group them together because what I'm doing is I'm telling the story of authority and power. It was the Jackson Democrat power structure that really led, that was co-opted by the slave owners essentially and used to their advantage. And that's what really pushed us towards civil war. And it's not to say that the Republicans didn't have anything to do with it. They absolutely did. They were reformed towards the end of that period of time. And it was really the opposing force. It's, like I talked about, every action has a reaction, right? And those two things is kind of what led to that rupture. So we'll get into that in the second half of the year. Let's talk about our Madisonian mission, John. What's your mission here?
Mission is to educate, to inform. I think we want to help teach people, really. Like, that's what it comes down to. And I think you and I kind of talked about this in the introductions, as we sort of became students of history on our own outside of the classroom, and that just shaped how we saw our governance structure. So we want to teach more people, because we realize that once you learn our founding principles and our founding truths, like, this country becomes so much more beautiful and so much more personal. Like, the fact that it feels so cold. I mean, we're just outside Washington D.C., but it was funny to rail against the Washington D.C. establishment maybe when you're campaigning, but like it feels kind of cold because you can't get a hold of your congressman or your senator because they don't have offices, they don't have the ability to talk, and I think we want to show people that that's not as it was intended.
Right. And so I try to avoid the word educate, right? Like I like to use the word inform, inform our community, because what I want to do is I want to give you information. I want to give you the information that I've picked up on. And I bring the books to the class. Like this is where I got my information. And I'm putting it out on packets, we're sending it out however we can. And this is my information. These are my ideas, your ideas, our ideas, because we worked on this as a team. And I want the people in our community to take this and go, all right, this doesn't sound right somewhere. Challenge,
Mhm.
study, take the information and combat me with different information if you think something is inaccurate, and that's okay. That's how it's a deliberative body, right?
Right.
Like we're acting as Congress, as essentially we're trying to in our own community.
And you're the speaker, but you're a benevolent speaker.
Yeah. So the goal realistically is to give our community the information to elect better leaders. To hope to find some people out there that want to be leaders and then give them the tools to do so, because something that we both learned on the campaign trail is it's really expensive to run for office.
Yeah.
And it's really difficult because they make it hard, both the parties and the PACs. It's a whole system. You basically, if you want to think about it this way. Imagine if you were a doctor, and in order to be a doctor, you had to fundraise for your business. You had to do commercials and all these you basically had to create this business and focus on this business all the time, and then also be a doctor. Like you didn't have time to study or like deal with patients, talk to people. You were so focused on selling yourself and raising money all the time. And that's essentially what's going on right now. The people running for office, most of their focus is on winning office. They are not focused on governing you. They don't have time to focus on governing you because of the system that they're in. It's not even really their fault. They're just stuck in the middle of it. And that's why, we have to start to address these issues, and we hope to be able to lower the cost for people simply having a good message. I think there's tools out there with podcasting and videos and advertising that you can do to lower it. You're working on a website that we'll be able to send out to people so they can use for different purposes, connect with their clientele or their constituents. That will be less expensive than going through the consultant and the PACs and all these different things, and that basically just take your money and funnel it into themselves and their own business, their own private businesses, kind of like the old spoil system of the the Gilded Age.
No, the idea behind the website in particular, like we used it we run it, the MadisonRepublicans.com. It's sort of the idea is to centralize things so that you have to worry about less. I mean, like when I ran for Congress, I did Eventbrite to manage events, and I had usually you have to run your own email list or like MailChimp, and then you get a voter registration database of some sort that you got to contact people, but they're all sort of different systems. And this is what I've discovered in my time of being a programmer is it's a lot easier when the data is all in one spot, and you can sort of build on top of that. So that's the idea, is to bring it all in one spot and build on top of it. So we've got the mailing list and the event management, and hopefully we'll get the door knocking. Actually, like I think that's a key thing, and we'll bring in the Jeff Mayhew system of door knocking rather than the consultant system of door knocking. Where you ask people, do you know that there's an election coming up, and start a conversation rather than yelling at them and saying like, I'm so and so, I'm running for this seat, can I count on your support? Because they don't know you, honestly. Like that's the problem, is no one knows you, and that's why the parties are so powerful. Because if you get that party branding, people say, oh, I know this person because the party's with them. And like that only strengthens a party system, and that's why you have to appeal to the same 15,000 people in our primary. If you're in a small House district, maybe it's only a couple hundred that are going to vote in a primary or a convention. So you need a way to reach those people. And I think that's the goal, is to build a tool where you can take a message, whatever it is. If it's not the Madison Republicans, it's fine. You're going to lose anyway, but take a message and then use that to reach people, and actually like reach people, like You know, as I like to say, like everyone's like, "Oh, it's so great that you're running for office," and it's like, no, you just fill out some paperwork and you ask people to vote for you.
Right. And what is that message? Like what so like if we're the Madisonian Republicans, right? And we're saying like regular people, yes, everything we're talking about, this is a long-term project. This is not going to happen overnight. But what are some things that like individual citizens that maybe be listening or reading our articles, like what could they focus on? And I've been thinking about this today. And I think if you right now it's primary season. For anybody that doesn't know, this is primary season. Okay.
In Virginia.
In Virginia, yes. And I keep forgetting people outside of Virginia may listen to this, but I'm in Virginia. Okay. And Virginians should lead. Just FYI. All right. So what do our citizens, what should they be talking to their delegates about? And I think campaign finance reform is the thing, right? Because it doesn't really matter what your personal issue is right now. Whoever you're voting for, if they are part of that, if they have to raise so much money into getting to office, that's who they're listening to. They're
Right.
listening to the people that pay them money. If you're out there voting for them and you're not donating large sums of money to you, they do not hear you. They
Mhm.
don't want to hear you. They're not trying to hear you. And again, part of it is maybe intentional by bad people, but for the most part, these people are good, decent human beings who just don't understand. Like they just think, hey, this is the system. This is what I got to do. If you go to events, local events here in Virginia, what you'll notice is it's the same people that show up to all the events. It's the same people donating the money. These are the people that are in charge. These are the
Mhm.
people that are electing our leaders that are essentially failing. Where I'm at, we're overtaken, and you out in Loudoun County, same thing, overtaken by a bad education system and data servers everywhere local. Well, how do you change that? You can vote in people that fight against it, or you can vote for people that change the system of how people get elected, lower the threshold of money into office, get people heard again with campaign finance reform. I think that's the number one thing you should be pressing every delegate, every state senator, say, what are you doing to solve campaign finance reform? Because they can write that at the state level and Virginia could ratify it. And it could be something that the nation adopts at a later time. We don't have to go top down. We can work from the bottom up. That's how the government and the system is supposed to work.
Yeah, and what would you say is the biggest thing in campaign finance reform? Would you limit a number of donation, the limit the donation amount? Would you limit like just the amount you can raise, the limit the amount that people can spend on a race?
I think the first basic, simple thing you could write into the legislature is a boundary line, right? So you're only taking in money from the place that you're like going to govern, which means if you're in VA District 10, and you're running for office, you cannot take in money from outside of VA District 10, which means like the way that the Democrats run their campaign finance in Virginia, it's all centralized through the Democratic Party. So everything goes into one fund and then they choose how to divvy it all out, which gives them complete control over everybody that runs for office.
Right.
If you write this simple, law that says, okay, all your money that gets spent in District 10 has to come from District 10, then all of a sudden you literally overnight you break that up and you say they have to come up with a new system, and you guarantee that the people, at least it's the people that have money inside the district doing it, right? Because you're not having Google and Amazon and all these different ways to secretly fund money through the system so they can, buy legislatures essentially to write rules that allow them to sell our land to data servers. We just become this big block everywhere.
Big, massive buildings that have no windows and eyesores.
Oh, and what do? There's no jobs. It messes with the drainage in the area. They haven't done the right amount of studies, but they're already willing to sell the land. I think Stanley Martin, which had bought a whole bunch of land up for housing, has decided to just build data servers. And think about that. The cost of housing is through the roof in this area. But instead of building more houses to lower the cost of living for Virginians, they are doing more data centers. And I thought, like, Youngkin signed a deal with Google not too long ago, and they're like touting this. The VA District 10 Twitter handle put this out, and I'm like, what are you doing? Like, everybody is against data centers, and here is Youngkin cutting another deal with the data center people, and it's like we are cheering this as Republicans. I don't understand this.
I mean, that's the team aspect. Like, you know, you got to be a team player. So if your person at top does it, you got to fall in line. Otherwise, you're a rhino.
Well, and that's the thing is like Youngkin is basically the president of Virginia, right? In the governmental structure. He's so far away from regular people. It's not his fault. Like, that's okay. Like, I want somebody that's wildly successful and like put themselves up in society to be the executive. You know, that's a good thing. But you have to have an independent legislature that doesn't just follow suit to what he says, because that's the check. You know, the executive's going to be from a wealthy part of the country, and they're going to be surrounded by wealthy people. They're going to want to do things to benefit wealthy people. Well, the legislator is supposed to be, or the delegate level are supposed to be regular people, and they're going to be focusing on regular people problems. And it's that deliberative body in between that helps govern us properly. So yeah.
Yeah, and manage it and sort of keep the executive in check. Imagine that. Checks and balances.
Checks and balances, man. I think we're going to talk about that soon. Listen, so what is I know that there's really no federal offices running, but I'm going to bring it up just because I want to. If you get your hands on a federal, somebody running for federal office, there's only one thing you need to tell them.
Expand
uncap the house. It's uncap. I used to say expand, but it's uncapped now. But yeah, uncap the house, man.
Which is key, because it's not just getting more seats, but the population, when the population decreases by a couple 100 million, for whatever calamity people are predicting, then you can shrink the house back to size.
Yeah, it's supposed to be a representative of the population. And when you cap it, it's not really representative of the population anymore.
It's representation of the California donors and who can court them.
Well, and think about it. We've talked about three different things here where capping it raised the cost. They capped the slave trade, which raised the cost of slaves, which made the slave owners more profitable. You capped basically the amount of housing in Virginia by switching everything to data centers. They stopped building housing, which raised the cost of living, which who does that benefit? That benefits all the capital, right? All the people that own the mortgages, right? The cost, all the housing, all goes up. And then you cap the house. And what does that do? It raises the cost of entry into politics, into the federal jurisdiction. And all of these things benefit wealthy. They all benefit people above most of us. And it's not to say like we're against, people being wealthy. I support, like, you should work your butt off and you should work to that level. It's just that we should have a fair system of debating these rules. And just because you've worked yourself to that level doesn't mean you have complete autonomy over that.
Right. You can just cut a check and that's it. I mean, people need to debate these ideas and discuss them.
Right. And then that's what happens. You cut a check, you get time with your representative, and I don't, because I don't have any money to show up to the fundraising event. Like, check your email. If you're on these email lists, look at how much it costs to go to these events sometimes, just to have your voice heard, just to see the person running for office. It's in the time, it's insane. It's insane. It discourages engagement from citizens.
Yeah. You're stuck with bumper stickers, if at most, but then because it can feel so toxic, sometimes you don't want to put a bumper sticker on because you don't want people to be mad at you.
Right. All right. So let's talk about our next meeting. What are we going to discuss at our next meeting, John?
Let me go to MadisonRepublicans.com and look it up because I don't remember off the top of my head. But fix this in post. Why don't you tell me, Jeff, because my phone's acting up.
We're going to discuss how the Republic works. We're going to break down the structure of our government. We're going to lay out, the executive's responsibilities, the court's responsibilities, the House's responsibilities, the Senate's responsibilities. And we're going to talk a little bit about how they were formed and why they were formed that way. And then we're going to talk about how regular people can use them, because these are tools, these are systems. They're for all of us, not just the people that run them. And we can make changes realistically. As long as we know, if you got to know the rules of the game, you got to know how the game's played. they're playing a money game and I'm playing a different game. I'm playing a government game. Like I understand the system. Most people that I interact with that are in politics, they are so focused on the fundraising aspect of it. They actually don't know how our system works at all, which gives a major advantage to regular citizens once you get informed, because
Yeah.
you'll probably know more than the person running for office. I will say, just a little pub out there. I went to somebody that was running for office in a district close to mine. I thought he was running for a different office, so I showed up there, and I got to say I was really impressed. I give a lot of hard time to people that I meet in politics, but Ian Lovejoy is running in, oh man, the 21st or the 22nd. I can't remember. I'm so sorry. He had a small little coffee talk with some citizens at Vina Nova a couple weeks ago, actually the day of our meeting. It was in the morning, and he knows his stuff. He understands the process. He really, I believe, is doing, working hard for the right reasons. And it shows. It shows in his communication skills. It shows in his knowledge. And if you're a citizen in this local area and you're looking for somebody to like raise up, go with somebody that knows the system, that isn't just focused on fundraising and whatnot. Not to say that he's not doing that, because he's got to win an election, and you shouldn't slight anyone for playing the game that's in there, but you should prop up the ones that know both sides of it, right?
Yeah.
Because he's going to be, if he actually gets in there, he'll be better suited to represent you and do a good job and get the things done that he's trying to get done.
So I mean, like I also went to a local campaign event this past Saturday, and again, like it's a lot of the same people that go to all the events, which is good in one sense because you get to see friends and acquaintances and whatnot. But it's also, when you want to bring people around, when you kind of have this idea that maybe I need to like bring people to get above 50% to win an election, you kind of, hopefully you can bring new faces to these events, new people into the effort. And that's where you like the information aspect comes in. You inform them what you stand for,
Right.
rather than just say, well, I'm part of this team, and if you don't like this team, don't vote for me, because where does it get from there? And that's one seat locally. There's another seat that there's some guy just kind of moved into because he got scared of another one. But again, like that person, when he talks about it, all he talks about is, we got to have a party convention because we need to get out there as fast as possible and attack the Democrats. And it's like, we've been doing that, attacking the Democrats, for how many cycles? And we've had very little to show for it, other than, unless you're in like a deep Republican district. Like, you're suburban Virginia, you got to bring people along. Youngkin may have won statewide, but he definitely lost Loudoun. But then there's pockets of Loudoun that he did pretty well in. So, the seats can be favorable in that sense, but that means that you got to do what Youngkin did. And I would say Youngkin was very good about informing people what he might do once he was in office, rather than sort of denigrating people. And he did a bunch of denigration, just as any politician might do. But he was very good about capturing something where Terry McAuliffe is basically like, well, parents don't matter. And so he grabs them and he says, parents do matter. And that's what he informs people on. It's like, I'm going to come in there and I'm going to listen to parents. And, going back to bureaucracies, not listening and not governing people. That's the school system in a nutshell the past couple of years. This is very,
Right.
I think it precedes the pandemic, but I think the pandemic kind of brought it into focus where, everything's been delegated to unelected bureaucrats with masters in education and doctors in education, and they know that they know best, so you better listen to them regardless. Right. And that's kind of, people talk about the parents of old, I think there's a little bit more to it than that, but like that is an ability where you've got people that you are supposed to ostensibly listen to you and sort of help guide you along. Either they say, that's a great idea, we'll incorporate that, or that idea is not going to work. But when it's just kind of a stone wall and you can't get anything through, that's where someone can come in and inform and say, like, I see the pain and I'm going to bring that along with you, and you can come along with me for the ride, rather than saying like, oh, if you can't stand this issue, then don't vote for me. Like, and that's be like the guy in Florida did that. Charlie Crist did that with Ron DeSantis, and probably that's why he get crushed by Ron DeSantis, because I think DeSantis is a little bit more willing to sort of, he fights a culture war in one aspect, but he also seems to listen and to try to bring people along on specific issues.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's really a politician out there I can name that is like going with the strategy of like ideas and positivity. everyone does that denigration. Youngkin did it, DeSantis did it, but where the two of them split a little bit from others is they do put out some ideas, right?
Mhm.
They do actually show some positivity. They show some guidance. Like that's leadership, right? Like, I mean, I would argue that DeSantis's behavior is not great leadership, but it doesn't mean that he doesn't have other qualities that are good leadership. And you should never write a person off. Everybody's able to come back from bad mistakes as long as they admit it. And I think what we need, especially at the local level, you need people that are focused not on Joe. Like if you go to a delegate, if you go to an event where you have somebody running for delegate and they mention Joe Biden's name, you should not vote for that person because
Not
that
at
person
all.
is not qualified to run for office because Joe Biden has really very little to do with their job. And it shows either one of two things. It shows their ignorance or they're willing to manipulate you. And
Mhm.
it's disappointing. So, check your local officials, see what they have on their websites. If they've got stuff about Joe Biden on there, like we can all not like Joe Biden. That's great. But what I want from my delegate is I want my delegate to do their job. And their job is not to talk about Joe Biden. Their job is to legislate my local community where Joe Biden has he has little control over it. You have more of it. And simply saying it's Joe Biden's fault you can't get anything done is escaping accountability
Yeah,
because you can get things done. You're just not doing a good enough job.
speaks to me.
It speaks to you.
No, I mean, like that's a frustration on the local school board level. Like, and that's why I've got this piece that I need to like finish up editing and stuff. But Virginia is definitely interesting in that the legislature, and this is just the tradition in Virginia from when we were founded from a colony to a state, is the legislature is the sole arbiter. Like it has all the power, and then it delegates that down to localities and says like, this is what you can manage. So I would say in Virginia specifically, your legislature is incredibly important, if not more important than like a local school board, because the legislature can say they change the Virginia code and they say school boards need to do X, Y, and Z. And if you don't do that, well, that's the other problem. They need some kind of accountability for school boards that don't do that. But
Right.
at the very least, like a lot of our policy is basically like, well, this is Virginia code and we got to do this. And that's different from the federal level where maybe I talked to this before, but like we ceded certain powers to the federal, but we kind of kept everything else.
Right.
Whereas Virginia, the legislature has all the power and it cedes it to localities to manage locally where it makes sense.
Right. And that's the best way, small groups,
Mhm.
everything is small groups. Okay. And it's easier to lead a group of 10 people than it is to lead a group of 100 people. If you had a group of 100 people, you'd probably find, I don't know, like 5 to 10 people to also be leaders, to break that group up into smaller groups so nobody got lost.
Yeah.
It's just the system that we live. It's just life, people.
But it's just, I mean, like that's human nature. I mean, like I think a lot of churches do that. They've got small
Right.
groups and stuff where you can sign up and you get assigned a little group and that's just discussion on specific topics. But again, it's taking a big thing of like theology in this case and breaking it down and with all the people.
And it provides better leadership. It provides better communication because if you've got one large group of 100 people versus 10 small groups of 10 people, you're going to have better conversation in the 10 small groups of 10 people than you're going to be having the one of 100. And then you have a representative from each one of those groups come together and then have a deliberate, debate about that. It almost sounds like our government.
Imagine that.
Imagine that.
You should try that sometime.
But I think we have this push in our country to get rid of these small groups, to get rid of this Republican form, to go to straight democracy, eliminate the electoral college, eliminate. I mean, people have talked about eliminating the Senate. I mean, it's insane. And we shouldn't do any of that, by the way. We should maintain our founding principles and build on them as opposed to demolishing them.
Well, it'd be one thing if someone said we need to get rid of the Senate for this particular reason because it's so broken. But I don't think anyone's come up with a reason like that. And in fact, I think a lot of people find the virtue of having two different legislatures drawing from two different distinct populations, trying to hash something out is slow and a little cumbersome. But I think it's better for all of us.
Right. I do. I mean, the states, they need to do a better job. I mean, we can go back to how they are elected into office. Maybe that's part of the reason why we don't have the right one, because the states, realistically, the Senate isn't representing the states anymore. They're representing people because they're voted straight democracy in the state. And if they were done through state legislatures, they would have more of a state focus on them. But it's an important body. We can't demolish it. We can't get rid of it. We can't get rid of the Electoral College. These are important checks and balances to our system that allows us from it stops us from centralizing too much power in one place and becoming a dictatorship.
So actually, this is what has come up in the Robert Wood book, is the 17th Amendment, the direct election of senators. A lot of people wanted that because the state legislatures were failing in their ability to nominate someone. So this goes back to people not doing their job, and then someone else gets upset and says, well, we'll fix this somehow. Like the state legislatures were not seating senators for specific states because they couldn't agree on someone, because they had a deadlock in the legislature somewhere. So that's an interesting bit of context that I discovered reading the Senate history book.
Well, I mean, and that it's funny because that kind of is how everything's worked in our country. And it goes back to that quote that I talked about from my pastor, like we drift, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like instead of looking back and understanding why do we have this system, that we look at the problem that we have now and we go, I'm going to fix this with this other thing. But you really just create a new problem. What you're supposed to do is hold that state legislature accountable to do their job. Okay. If they didn't nominate somebody, then they are out representation in the Senate, and eventually it's kind of like your kid, right? Like if your kid does something wrong, I tell my wife all the time, like we have a different parenting style. Sometimes parents are very like helicoptery. They're just like on top, like if your kid's not doing it, you want to fix it right away. And I'm more of like a handoff type parent. If my kid isn't doing something and isn't listening, I'm like, all right, go to your room. Like if you throw a temper tantrum, I'll just let you scream and whine. Eventually, you're going to get bored up there. You're going to come down. You're going to admit what you did wrong, because I'm not going to tell you. You already know. And you come tell me. That shows me that you've now held yourself accountable, because part of holding yourself accountable is simply admitting what you did wrong. And then I ask you a question and say, all right, well, what are you going to do differently next time to make sure this doesn't happen? And that's the state. Hey, you threw your temper tantrum. You didn't throw anybody into office. Cool. We'll go on without you. I don't need you here watching TV with me. Go up in your room and throw your temper tantrum. When you're done and you're ready, come down and tell me why you were wrong. And then nominate somebody. All right.
Sounds like a good parenting segment right there.
Oh yeah, that's our parenting segment for the show. I didn't even think about it. So a couple things out there I wanted to touch on real quick. I got this little video. It's on my Instagram page. John, I sent it to you. It's as concise as I think I can be, explaining why we need more representation, why this is the most important thing that you should focus on as an individual citizen when it comes to the federal level, and that is appropriate representation for your district. And it's because it's communication. It's the best way to govern and to make sure that your voice is heard in your government. So go to my Instagram page, check that out. I posted on my Facebook page if you're on there as well. Maybe we can get it.
That March meeting is representation is communication too. So,
that's right.
While you're registering for the February 18th meeting, you can register for March 18th.
Right. 20th. And, a lot of you out there, you come up to me out in public, we're at different events. You're like, oh man, I really want to come to your event. Great. I got 6 of them ready to go. Go RSVP now. You can plan ahead, right? Like I understand, like we got busy schedules and stuff. That's why we put the stuff out so far in advance. So you can plan and prepare, and don't feel bad if you can't come to all of them. We're gonna put stuff out there, like this, where we do little overviews with articles that you can read to catch up on. We'll eventually we're gonna get this stuff up on our website, right, John?
Yeah.
Sorry. I'm putting all the work on him. He knows how to do it. I don't. But eventually we'll get it up on our website as well. That way people can have a central point of data to come to this, a central point of information, so they can be guided, to challenge, to talk, to communicate, whatever you feel necessary to do. So yeah, and then the history of the United States article, I think is really important in understanding that it's just kind of factioning powers fighting back and forth all the time, hit back and forth, and that's what we're going through now, and we can overcome it.
Yeah, we've been here before. We fixed those problems, got it through. We'll get through again.
That's right. Well, I think that's a good show, John.
It's a good show. I'm gonna listen to it. I'll tell you that.
Look, I got all my books organized back here. I started my office today, finally.
Oh,
Um,
nice.
my wife has been, that's been a project that has been put off. That's why I'm wearing the flannel. I'm back to the flannel today because I was doing the carpentry work. Took my son to Lowe's. We picked out all the stuff. We got started. So hopefully in the next couple of weeks, I'll have a nice big picture of James Madison behind me in my office that will and I'll have those books on a shelf so my wife can stop complaining that they're in the middle of the dining room.
One day we all can dream.
One day. But in the meantime, go to our website, madisonianrepublicans.com, check out our events, go RSVP for whatever event you want to do. Bring a friend. I find it easier to go to uncomfortable places with someone I'm comfortable with. So if you're coming out to our event, I understand that politics can be uncomfortable. I promise we do our best to make it comfortable for you. Our meeting structure is set up in a way that it's more like having a conversation than it is like just being spoken to. The first 30 minutes is open. You're just talking to people, and typically you get people that are just concerned like you are. Realistically, they don't really know what's going on and they don't like it, and they're just coming out to see a different perspective. Yeah. So I encourage you to bring a friend. I promise I'll be nice. I don't bite anymore. I stopped that about 2 or 3 years old. So if I bring one of my kids, maybe they'll bite you, but they're little, so
They're pretty well trained. They're missing a couple of teeth, so it's smaller.
they are. They got the big old gap tooth right in the middle, both of them. So, John, you got anything you want to add out there for the people before we sign off?
No, just my wife was talking about gratitude today, so just I'm grateful again to the people who showed up. Saturday afternoons are not the easiest time, and it validates what Jeff and I are doing, which I definitely, it's easier to do stuff when you get outside validation. And I just thanks again, and thanks for listening.
Yeah, and real quick, as far as gratitude, I want to say thank you to my team. Right, you, your brother Daniel, Craig, and Phil, you guys helped write this packet. This wasn't all just one person. This was a team effort. We're already working on our Jacksonian packet. We're already working on our How the Republic Works packet, fine tuning these things so they're ready to go for the people out there. And I got to say, it's really great to have such thoughtful people to bounce ideas off of. Like it's a really good environment for me. I really enjoy it. Craig and Phil, I love the different aspects that we get. And Daniel, man, he really nailed it with the Thomas Jefferson and the Benjamin Franklin bios. I absolutely loved it. So it makes me happy to talk about history with people, to talk about government with people in such a civilized way. So thank you to everybody out there.
That's what our meetings are like, guys. It's happy, fun.
That's right. All right. So remember, go to MadisonianRepublicans.com and register for your next event. If you want to check out the articles, you can either go to my Facebook, Instagram page, or Twitter handle to find it, or you can go to Politics and Parenting on the Substack app. You can like, share, subscribe, whatever you feel necessary to get your voice heard. We'd love to have a conversation with you. And thank you for listening. Peace and love.